Reparations versus repealing CRT. Critics argue that not allowing critical race theory, CRT, in schools can be dangerous for several reasons, especially regarding how history, race, and systemic inequality are discussed. Here are the main concerns about banning or restricting CRT in education. 1. Limits. Comprehensive understanding of history. Critique. Banning CRT might result in an incomplete or sanitized version of history being taught, particularly regarding issues of racism, slavery, segregation, and the civil rights movement. Critics argue that students may not fully understand the complexities of racial history in the U.S., which could lead to a lack of awareness about the origins and impacts of systemic racism. Danger. Without critical discussions about race and inequality, students might be unprepared to navigate or address ongoing racial issues in society, potentially perpetuating ignorance and misunderstanding. 2. Prevents honest conversations about race. Critique. Not allowing CRT in schools may stifle necessary conversations about race, inequality, and privilege. By avoiding these discussions, critics argue that schools miss opportunities to teach students how to engage in meaningful dialogue about race relations in America. Danger. Avoiding or downplaying these conversations could lead to students growing up without the tools to address or understand contemporary racial issues, exacerbating societal divisions and racial tension. 3. Ignores systemic racism. Critique. CRT is rooted in the idea that racism is not just a matter of individual prejudice, but is embedded in legal systems and institutions. By banning CRT, critics argue that schools ignore the broader systemic nature of racism and how it has shaped societal structures. Danger. Without understanding systemic racism, students may be ill equipped to recognize and address inequality in areas like education, healthcare, criminal justice, and employment, potentially hindering progress toward greater racial justice and equity. Fourth, stifles critical thinking. Critique. CRT encourages students to think critically about laws, policies, and power dynamics, particularly in the context of race and class. Banning CRT may limit the development of critical thinking skills by preventing students from engaging with challenging and complex topics. Danger. If schools avoid tough conversations about race and inequality, students may be left with superficial or simplistic understandings of these issues, undermining their ability to engage thoughtfully and responsibly with diverse perspectives. 5. Excludes marginalized voices. Critique. CRT provides a framework for including the experiences and perspectives of marginalized groups, particularly African Americans, in discussions of U.S. history and law. Not allowing CRT could lead to the exclusion of these voices, reinforcing a Eurocentric or dominant culture narrative. Danger. Marginalized communities might feel further alienated or erased from the educational narrative, and students from all backgrounds might not develop empathy or understanding for the experiences of people from different racial or socioeconomic backgrounds. 6. Perpetuates myths of a post racial society. Critique. By not discussing systemic racism and its lasting effects, schools might reinforce the idea that America is now a post racial society where racial issues are no longer significant. Critics argue that this ignores ongoing racial disparities in areas like policing, healthcare, housing, and education. Danger. Students may develop a false sense of racial equality and fail to recognize or address the very real inequalities that persist today, making it harder to work toward a more just and equitable society. 7. Suppresses free inquiry and diverse perspectives. Critique. Some view the ban on CRT as an attempt to suppress free inquiry and intellectual diversity in education. By limiting what can be taught, critics argue that schools are curbing academic freedom and preventing students from being exposed to a wide range of ideas and perspectives. Danger: a lack of diverse perspectives could narrow students' worldviews, prevent them from developing informed opinions, and limit their ability to engage with complex social issues in a thoughtful, informed way. Conclusion: the concern among those who oppose the banning of CRT is that it could lead to an incomplete and less critical understanding of American history, prevent necessary conversations about race and inequality, and exclude the experiences of marginalized groups. They argue that not allowing CRT in schools could result in a less informed, less empathetic, and less prepared generation when it comes to addressing ongoing social and racial issues in the US. Banning critical race theory, CRT, can undermine the argument for reparations by removing a framework that explains the historical and systemic foundations of racial inequality in the US. Here's how it impacts the reparations debate. 1. Suppresses understanding of historical injustice. CRT. Context: CRT provides a framework that highlights how racial inequalities are rooted in historical practices like slavery, segregation, and discriminatory policies, such as Jim Crow laws and redlining. These policies have had long term effects on wealth accumulation, education, housing, and economic opportunities for African Americans. Impact of ban: by banning CRT, schools might avoid teaching the depth of these historical injustices and their long lasting impact on Black communities, making it harder to argue that present day inequalities are linked to past wrongs. Without this context, the argument for reparations can lose its foundation in understanding systemic harm over generations. 2. Ignores systemic racism and its legacy. CRT context: CRT emphasizes that racism is not just a matter of individual prejudice, but is embedded in institutions and systems that continue to produce unequal outcomes for different racial groups. This understanding supports the reparations argument by showing that systemic harm requires systemic solutions like reparations. Impact of ban: banning CRT could downplay or deny the role of systemic racism in perpetuating inequality. Without acknowledging these systemic factors, it becomes harder to justify reparations as a necessary remedy for institutional harms that continue to affect African Americans today. 3. Weakens the case for reparative justice. CRT context: reparations are often seen as a form of reparative justice, addressing the lasting harm caused by slavery and racial discrimination. CRT frames these issues as part of a larger, enduring system of racial oppression that continues to impact Black Americans, thereby justifying reparations as part of righting historical wrongs. Impact of ban: without CRT, schools and public discourse may shift away from the idea that reparative justice is needed to address the intergenerational harm done to Black communities. This undermines the argument that modern inequalities are a direct result of historical injustices that require compensation or restitution. 4. Limits public awareness of racial wealth gap. CRT context: CRT helps highlight economic disparities between racial groups, showing how policies such as slavery, land seizures, and exclusion from wealth building opportunities, e.g., home ownership, GI Bill benefits, created a significant wealth gap between white and Black Americans. This wealth gap is a central argument for reparations as it shows the lasting economic impact of these injustices. Impact of banning CRT could prevent students and the public from fully understanding the root causes of racial wealth inequality. If people aren't educated on how historical practices led to these disparities, they might be less likely to support reparations, seeing present day inequality as a result of personal or cultural failings rather than systemic injustice. Five, shifts focus away from collective responsibility. CRT context, CRT promotes the idea that society as a whole has a collective responsibility to address racial inequalities, including considering reparations as part of a broader effort to rectify the past. It emphasizes that wealth, privilege, and opportunity are unequally distributed as a result of historical and systemic racism. Impact of ban. Without CRT, the discussion might shift toward individual responsibility and meritocracy, ignoring the broader societal obligations to address racial harm. This could weaken the case for reparations, as collective responsibility is a key argument for why society should provide compensation for the enduring effects of slavery and racial discrimination. Six, silences marginalized voices. CRT. Context. CRT seeks to elevate the voices of marginalized groups, particularly African Americans, by highlighting their experiences and the ongoing impact of racial discrimination. This focus on lived experience supports the argument that Black Americans have suffered disproportionately and deserve reparations as part of healing those harms. Impact of ban. Banning CRT could silence these voices in the classroom and in public discourse, making it harder to center the experiences of Black Americans when discussing the need for reparations. Without these perspectives, the movement for reparations may lose visibility and support. Conclusion. Banning CRT can weaken the argument for reparations by limiting discussions of historical and systemic racism, downplaying the long term effects of racial injustice, and preventing a full understanding of how the racial wealth gap and other inequalities are tied to America's past. Without this framework, the case for reparations as a necessary form of justice and redress becomes more difficult to make.
Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, y'all. Period. She said it.